Hello. In the 6th century AD, a successful and intelligent Roman politician called Boethius found himself unjustly accused of treason. Trapped in his prison cell awaiting a brutal execution, he found solace in philosophical ideas about the true nature of reality, about injustice and evil, and the meaning of living a moral life. His thoughts didn't save him from death, but his ideas lived on because he wrote about them. He called the book The Consolation of Philosophy. The Consolation of Philosophy was read widely, and the sense of consolation is woven into many philosophical ideas. But what, for Boethius, were the consolations of philosophy? What are they more generally? And should philosophy lead us to consolation or lead us from it? With me to discuss the Consolation of Philosophy are Roger Scruton, Research Professor at the Institute for the Psychological Sciences, Melissa Lane, Senior University Lecturer in History at the University of Cambridge, and Anthony Grayling, Professor of Philosophy at Birkbeck College, University of London. Anthony Grayling, I understand that the form of the book is a dialogue between Boethius and a grey-eyed lady. Could you elaborate on that?
The grey-eyed lady is a giveaway. That's Athene, or Athena, who that was one of her epithets, I think, given by Homer. And she is a personification of wisdom. Well, she is the goddess of wisdom, and therefore the patron saint of all those who inquire. And it's very important in this connection to remember that the word philosophy and its etymological origins meant something much more general than we understand by philosophy now. It meant inquiry, it meant thinking about things, it meant reflecting on the world, on one's experience of the world, on one's life. So it had a much more embracing, much more inclusive sense than it has now. And so when Boethius, in his solitude and in his very uncomfortable situation, was visited notionally by the grey-eyed lady, it was an opportunity to reflect and think and inquire.
And can you tell listeners what form the book takes?
Well, I suppose it's really a dialogue. It's an inheritor of a tradition in the classical period of presenting arguments discursively through the medium of dialogue, through an encounter, a challenge, because what philosophy does is challenges Boethius to stop being miserable and to start thinking and to start making use of his resources of reason and education so that he can somewhat, at any rate, ameliorate the circumstances in which he finds himself.
Honestly, can you give us some idea about what he's saying? Is he talking about the process of philosophy, the process of inquiry, which was the word introduced by Anthony? Is he talking about that as being the way to find consolation?
Well, what's wonderful about the book is that while, as Anthony said, it's modeled on a Socratic dialogue, actually, whereas when Socrates faces death, he is preternaturally calm and cheerful. He never admits to any fear in the face of death. Whereas Boethius begins his book by bewailing his fate, saying, I've been cast into prison, I've lost my library, I've lost my liberty, I've lost my honors and fame. And even all his philosophical education has not prevented him from this despair. And so what's so powerful and humane about the book is that it represents this philosophical dialogue in which philosophy has to recall him to his better self. And she actually uses the figure of philosophy
appears as a figure,
as this woman figure, absolutely. And she uses also the muses of poetry and rhetoric in what she calls her medicine for Boethius. So she's doctoring him and recalling him, giving him stronger and stronger medicine progressively through the book so that he can reach the consolation of understanding that true happiness only lies in the contemplation of God, which is goodness.
Can we have a little more context about Boethius and the time from you now before we move on? It's past the end of the Roman Empire in a way. The barbarians are not at the gate, they're taken over, but the Rome goes on in some ways, and he becomes a consul. He writes in Latin, of course, and so on. Can you tell us a little more about him and the situation in which he found himself?
Well, Boethius has been called the last of the Romans and the first of the scholastics, and I think that captures him very well. So although the last Western emperor had been deposed by a barbarian king, nevertheless the Senate still functioned, and Boethius held these very high honors, rising to be the master of the horse in the empire. And his sons also became consuls. And he actually had chosen to live that life because he had been educated in the Greek and Roman and Latin classics, and indeed was one of the first people to begin translating large portions of Plato and Aristotle from Greek into Latin. And so he made major contributions in his writings to philosophy, writing major treatises on music, on mathematics, and logic, but believed that he should live the life of a philosopher in politics, a philosopher king in Plato's terms, following in the footsteps of the great Roman philosophers, and so had dedicated himself to civic life.
Is there a sense in which there was bound to be a clash between him continuing to live the Roman life, where the barbarians, let's keep calling them that, had taken over and were wanting to run the empire in a different way?
I don't think it's quite as straightforward as that, because arguably what happened to him was a matter of politics between the western part of the empire and the eastern empire. So the only Roman empire at this point is in the east. So Boethius, perhaps because of his Greek learning, was suspected of having some interest in trying to bring about a reconciliation of the Western Church and the Eastern Church. So it's not quite as straightforward as any Roman at this period who still held to Roman values would have been accused, but it is probably true that his classical education would have made him more sympathetic to the claims of the East, and then he was suspected of treason by this Western barbarian ruler.
And it was out of that context that he was accused and put in prison. Yeah.
Exactly.
Roger Scruton, as I understand it, the Consolation of Philosophy is thought of as a Neo-Platonist book. Do you agree with that? And if so, can you tell me what that means?
Yes, I suppose I'm bound to agree with it, because it's what the scholars say. But one thing that Melissa and Anthony have not said, which I think should be said, is that each book of the Consolation begins with a poem. And actually, they're rather beautiful poems. And it's quite clear that for Boethius, the poetic way of dealing with things was continuous with the philosophical, that, as it were, one could remake one's experience through poetry as much as one could do through the abstract thinking. But that said, Plato, after all, was quite similar in that respect. That said, I think what Boethius took from Plato was the idea that we understand this world only if we can see it from the divine perspective. That means abstracting from time, from the process of our lives, and seeing things as they would appear to a purely eternal being. And that he thought, and this was, I think, the standard Neoplatonist thought, that we can, in this life, rise to that perspective, and that philosophy is one of the ways in which we do it. And having achieved that perspective, we see the order in things here below, and in seeing that order, we see that those things which had caused us to suffer, in fact, don't merit any such response, that they are part of a greater good and a larger whole.
When the name Plato is mentioned, people think Greek, they think pagan, and yet Boethius was a Christian. But the feeding in of Platonic ideas into the Christian religion was very marked. So can you develop that with regard to this book and regard to the influence it had on Boethius?
I wish I could, but I think some scholars disagree that Boethius was a Christian, actually, but I'm not sure whether this is relevant. The fact is that St. Augustine was also a Neoplatonist of a similar hue, and through St. Augustine's writings, Platonism entered the teaching of the Church from an early age. But the Neoplatonist view didn't only get incorporated into the Christian view, it was incorporated into the Islamic view as well, shortly after, in the early days of Arabic philosophy, but because it lends itself to the idea of the one God, one eternal being who is both creator of the world and also the provider of our redemption.
And that to which you should aspire through your creative virtue, going in the direction of the good and the God.
Exactly, that it's the thing towards which you rise from this world, and it's where your home is, your home as a spiritual being.
Anthony Grayling.
Yes, it's always intrigued and to some extent amused me at any rate to look at this process by which the Platonic aspiration to the good, which is the highest of the forms, had been, very interestingly, habilitated into a conception where the good is a divinity, a divine person. And the way that the idea of an ultimate repose for the soul's quest, the quest of the immortal soul to re-attain communion with the forms, with the eternal and immutable truths of things, which you find in Plato, has been reconfigured in Neoplatonism, and that's precisely why it is that both Christianity and Islam found it very agreeable to them. Not all Neoplatonists were either Christians or Muslims, of course, but the idea of this vision of things sub specie aeternitatis, from the viewpoint of eternity, as Roger was saying there, giving a sense of the divine order of things. It borrows, by the way, some of the lineaments of views about the order, the pattern of reality in Stoicism. The Stoics had the view that the logos, the principle of reason, underlay all things in the universe. And what we're witnessing in the first few centuries after the birth of Jesus is a kind of rewriting of those sorts of insights philosophically into a metaphysic which is very congenial to a more religious outlook.
Can I ask each of you in turn, what for Boethius were the consolations of philosophy? Melissa?
Well, in some way, Boethius, I think, found that the consolation was that one shouldn't and didn't need consolation, in the sense that if you actually understood what you thought were your sorrows, so his sorrow at losing fame, at losing wealth, at losing liberty, actually those things are transitory. They can't give us the sort of perfect, self-sufficient and permanent happiness that we seek, and only philosophy can give us that. So the process of philosophy consoling him is actually a process of saying, actually, there was never anything to be sorry for having lost.
Roger Scruton.
He also addresses serious questions which trouble us in this life, like the question of evil. Why is there evil? How is that compatible with the goodness of God? And he advances what is actually quite interesting solution to that, arguing that from God's perspective, since it's an eternal perspective, there is no evil. Everything is reconciled. Evil only can be perceived by us in time. We see it as part of a process, but since all processes ultimately are unreal or absorbed into this static eternal vision, then there's no paradox in thinking that evil, in fact, disappears from the higher perspective.
Anthony?
Which is, of course, a very consoling view for somebody to whom the thumbscrews are being applied at this moment. What's rather interesting about the solution that Boethius comes to, as Melissa describes it, is a very common, I think, a very deep and important theme which has run through all thinking about life, because you find something very similar indeed in Spinoza many centuries later. You find it in the poetry of Horace, for example. You find it in the attitude of all those who say, you find it in Marcus Aurelius, sort of late Stoic thinker, who says, when you die, what you lose is the present moment, because the past has ceased to be, the future has not yet come. I mean, this idea of what you think you're losing, what it gives you pain to contemplate the loss of, in fact, is insufficiently important in itself. And that realization alone frees you from the agony that you experience when you contemplate it. Although, of course, for Boethius, he has this additional point, which is that there is going to be a sort of consummation, because of his orientation on the metaphysics, since he is a man of some kind of faith at least, that there would be some sort of resolution to be provided by that. But for somebody like David Hume, I mean, Hume also spoke about this, about the consolation that there is in knowing that you would be liberated finally to a state rather similar to that of being unborn, which is also a great consolation.
Melissa, you wanted to get in.
Well, I think in this moment of the financial crisis, it helps to recall one sentence of Boethius about this issue of fortune, when he said, "If riches cannot eliminate need, but on the contrary create new demands, what makes you suppose that they can provide satisfaction?" And that idea that he's unmasking the purported goods of fortune as not real goods, I think, is actually had a tremendous influence in later philosophy. So he uses the phrase the wheel of fortune. Fortune spins her wheel, and sometimes we lose, sometimes we win. But and in medieval and Renaissance thought, that image of Fortune's wheel, Lady Fortune as a false goddess, was one of the great influences of Boethius.
Roger Scruton, one of the striking things about this book is that in medieval time, almost, give or take, 1,000 years later, 800 years later anyway, it enters into medieval literature, into the greatest medieval literature, and the most influential. I mean, it comes into Chaucer, for instance. What was the attraction there? How did it so easily and so fluently fit in there?
Well, of course, Chaucer translated the book into English prose, and it influenced his way of perceiving not just the redemption of human beings, but also the relations between them. And it's partly because of the philosophy of courtly love, which he took over from the French sources, but which maybe had its origin in Andalusian Arabic literature. But anyway, the philosophy of courtly love tells us that we only love truly if we love each other from that higher perspective. And this is an idea which goes back to Plato, of course, that the first stirrings of erotic desire could mislead us into thinking that carnal union is the the goal, but actually they're really an invitation to transcend that and to rise to another perspective where lovers are united as eternal beings. And this is a philosophy which is beautifully expounded in the Knight's Tale in Canterbury Tales, and is embellished all along the way with thoughts from Boethius.
And in Grayling, you mentioned Spinoza earlier. We again taking up the idea that the philosophy can take you into a world of higher understanding, intellectual, moral, spiritual. Can you develop that with Spinoza and what Spinoza is saying that this gives us?
In the fourth and fifth books of the Ethics by Spinoza, Spinoza turns attention to this question of how we should view ourselves and the world, with a view to explaining how a right view of ourselves and the world will liberate us from all the things that cause us pain. So it in fact is a provision of consolation in exactly Boethius's sort of sense. The fourth book is called Of Human Bondage, and it explains how it is that we imprison ourselves in false ideas, inadequate ideas, as he would say, sort of half-baked, half-formed conceptions which mislead us about how things are. And the fifth and final book of the Ethics, Of Human Freedom, explains that if only we really understand things clearly, if only our ideas of things are truly adequate, which is the technical term he uses, are true of the way things are with the world, we free ourselves from the agonies that are caused by those inadequate ideas. And so, the sort of terminus of this inquiry, which is why it's called the ethics, because it's about how we are and how we live and how we understand things in the end, is a form of liberation. And the liberation comes from recognizing that everything happens of necessity.
So are you saying, and would listeners be able to interpret this as, the study of philosophy will in itself make you kinder, generous, freer? Am I surrounded by these wonderful people? Of course I am. But is there a connection with what we can sort of call in the vernacular real life going on here? What do you think, Roger?
Well, to take up Anthony's point, Spinoza obviously thought so, because the free man, who is the one who has this adequate conception of the world, is also one whose moral character is utterly trustworthy, because he sees things as they are and doesn't put the kind of false valuation on his own appetites that less educated people would do. But
it's always about appetites, isn't it, really?
Well, appetites are our problem. If we didn't...
But they're our pleasure as well.
Of course. This is why the Platonic view is so different in the end from the Aristotelian. The Aristotelian view is that we shouldn't abolish our appetites and achieve the viewpoint of pure reason, that we should, on the contrary, educate them through the practice of virtue, so that then we want the right things on the right occasions and to the right extent, and that is what human fulfillment requires. But that is a completely different approach.
Melissa?
It's important that it's not just appetites. I think it is also this desire for fame or glory, which, of course, if we go back to Boethius, in the Roman world would have been the great ambition of any Roman senator would have been to achieve fame. And I think one of the messages of some of the later reception of the book also, for example, Queen Elizabeth did a translation for her own use just at a moment when she was disappointed with the lukewarm support and treachery of Henry IV of France, and she talked, and one of the phrases in that is "glory is vain," and so the philosopher has to rise above even the noble desire for fame, for service, for public good, and realize that even that also pales in comparison to the satisfaction of contemplation of the good.
Again and again it's confirmed that Queen Elizabeth I is the most brilliant monarch we've ever had. The most scholarly and brilliant person who's ever sat on the throne, maybe any throne. But, Roger Scruton, to what extent does this idea still depend on the fact that existence is in some sense rational? If we're going to pursue that idea of Boethius through, if we're taking what you suggested from Neoplatonism, are we talking about the world out there being rational? I would imagine that a lot of people think there's neither rhyme nor reason in it.
Well, the concept of fortune encapsulates that idea that the world, judged independently of us, doesn't follow any rational pattern. But we still have the freedom that reason confers on us, which is the freedom to look on it from another perspective, to stand back from it, as it were, and try and conceive it as a whole. And that is a rational enterprise which does, according to this tradition, liberate us from enslavement to fortune.
How do you find the reason, though? When you get there, how do you know it's the reason that you want to look, that you have found?
That's a very good question. I suspect that all of us know exactly what the distinction between a rational and an irrational argument is. But we might not be able to put it into words. But nevertheless, the idea is that by using our reason, we are being guided in some sense by something which has authority for us, greater than anything else that could guide us, and that we know this when we're doing it.
Is unreason sometimes wiser, though, Anthony Grayling?
Well, look, the idea of rationality in play here has two applications. One is to the process of our thinking about things and our attempt to make some sense of them. And the other is to the order of things, whether nature itself or the universe itself is in some way rationally comprehensible because it is structured. What one thinks here of Hegel's slogan, "The real is the rational," that somehow or other reality has to be rational, and anything which is irrational can't be part of it. Now, it's a very long-standing theme, again from the thought of classical antiquity, that whatever belongs to reality, the nature of reality itself, has to be deeply rational. This, again, is the Stoic idea of the logos, the principle of things, that fundamentally the world is logical. And that means that there is a chance for the rational inquiry to discover it in the literal sense of that term, to find out what that order is. But there's a quite different conception, which is that reason, by its exercise, can impose some kind of rationality on things. It may be that in the nature of things there is this incoherence, this chaos, which explains why the wheel of fortune spins so erratically. But nevertheless, by stepping back and taking a calmer and a more studied perspective on things, just as Roger describes, you can make a kind of sense for yourself. You can navigate a route through that incoherence, which makes of your own experience a kind of rationality.
Melissa?
Well, I think there's an interesting contrast between a philosophy which would say, as Boethius did, if we look at the world, it may appear irrational, but it's really rational. So that's Boethius or Hegel. But then opposed to that, you might have a view which says, well, the world as we see it really is irrational, but there's another world which is rational. And that would be, for example, Schopenhauer in the early 19th century, who says, well, we can't make sense of this world. It is a vale of tears. It is just simply the exercise of desires and passions and bad judgments and mistakes and so forth. But there's another world beyond where we can contemplate some truth. And I think that's a very interesting shift from the idea that the world as we see it is intelligible to reason to projecting that elsewhere.
Are you elasticating it too much, though, that word?
I don't think so. I mean, I think it's terribly important to realise that there isn't a straightforward confrontation between emotion or appetite or the non-rational on the one hand and rationality on the other, that there is a kind of partnership here. Even somebody who was sceptical about the possibility of the deliverances of reason to solve final philosophical problems, somebody like Hume, for example, who thought that reason could only ever be the handmaid of the passions, nevertheless a tremendously important handmaid. I mean, supposing you woke up one morning with an overwhelming desire to go to Bognor Regis. Well, reason would tell you how to get there, even though reason didn't give you that motivation in the first place.
You have me there. As Boethius goes through his discussion and his education with philosophy, what is he arriving at? Can you just keep us back to the book for a second? Where is he getting to?
Well, he's getting to this understanding of the nature of the world as in terms of providence, so that everything is ultimately intended by God for good. And actually, I think, as Roger said earlier, I think it's interesting to contrast that actually with the purely Platonic source, with Plato's view, because for Plato, actually, there's a limit to the intelligibility of the world. So the world is good up to a point, and then that point is matter, and matter isn't intelligible. So there is sort of real evil and chaos in the world. Whereas for Boethius, he couldn't accept that now as a Christian. And so he has to say, actually, because that would be too Manichaean, we would perhaps then have the devil being an independent power. And so he has to say, actually, even what seems to be evil is not really evil. And so actually here I think there's a real break between the Platonic view and the Neoplatonic view. For the Neoplatonic view, evil is only sort of apparent. In reality, it's only the deprivation of goodness. It has no independent power.
Roger Scruton.
Yes, that idea of evil being, in some sense, a nothing, because it's merely the absence of good, was a very powerful one. I mean, he fed obviously into Christian and Muslim ways of thinking, and has survived up to this day. And, of course, in Thomism, in St. Thomas Aquinas, in the philosophy of St. Thomas Aquinas, that idea is absolutely fundamental, that evil is a deprivation, not a reality in itself.
Schopenhauer's been mentioned, the 19th century German philosopher. What kind of consolation, if any, if that was one of his aims, did Schopenhauer set out to achieve?
Well, Schopenhauer was perhaps the first major philosopher to be influenced by the Hindu way of thinking. The Upanishads had only recently been translated into Latin from a Persian version, and he read them with great enthusiasm, thinking that this is the way. So his notion of consolation was one of withdrawal, complete withdrawal from the world, the renunciation of the will. It's the will that drags us into conflict with things and is the true source of all unhappiness. And we should take a lesson, he thought, from the Hindus, for whom this renunciation of the world was the way to overcome unhappiness, overcome suffering, and achieve what consolation we can, the consolation being a purely negative thing.
Is there any sense in which he is? You can find a line between Boethius and Schopenhauer?
Yes, there are lines, but it's clear that Boethius loved the world and Schopenhauer hated it, and this, their philosophies reflect these different psychological dispositions.
The Schopenhauerian view is beautifully summed up by one of his disciples, whose name I'm afraid escapes me at the moment, who said everybody ought to be educated to the point at which they can understand Schopenhauer's philosophy. They would then commit mass suicide, and the quantum of suffering in the world would be dramatically reduced. Because, you see, Schopenhauer took the view that noumenal reality, the way things are in themselves in the universe, consists of will, of conatus, of a desire to survive, to live, to strive. And this is the source of suffering. This is what gives us our agony of existence. And if we deny that, if we can reject that or free ourselves from it, then we will have achieved that ultimate consolation. So, in a sense, he is of this long tradition which attempts to teach us how we can escape the sources of pain in life and find that ultimate peace. It was, after all, the great desire of the post-Aristotelian ethical schools in antiquity, and post-classical antiquity, to achieve what they called ataraxia, which means peace of mind or tranquility. And that's a theme which, of course, persists right the way to this day.
Well, Elaine, there's the idea of stoicism, which I'm not quite sure whether Boethius took on or reacted against. Can you bring that into play?
It's a difficult question. I mean, at one point in the book, he makes a negative remark about the Stoics, but actually I think one can see a marked influence, particularly in the first two books of the Consolation, and in particular, it's the idea that the wise man should neither hope nor fear, so that you don't, external things have no value or relevance to your happiness. And at that point, I think the Neoplatonism and Stoicism are sort of close enough, so he wouldn't have accepted all aspects of Stoicism, but on that sort of core ethical point, I think he does learn from it.
There's an interesting thing about Stoicism, which was, after all, the outlook of most educated people for something like half a millennium before Christianity became more influential. And it seeped so much into the thinking of all different schools that it's very hard not to find Stoical influences. So this idea of courage towards the inevitable and self-mastery wherever possible over your own appetites, your fears, your desires, and so on, is a very, very common theme. Indeed, I think when you read somebody like Cicero, when you look at the professed Stoics like Epictetus or Marcus Aurelius, you're hearing something or seeing something, at any rate, which is very familiar at all stages of our Western tradition, because this idea, this Stoic principle, is lodged very deep in the shoe of Western civilization.
Yes, I think that's right. And there's a great difference between those who take the Stoic principles as part of a philosophy of action, the thing that enables you to do things and achieve things in this world, and those who see it, on the contrary, as a philosophy of renunciation, that this is the way to stand back from the world. And, I think this is one of the major differences running through all our philosophical tradition.
It stems actually from the fact that the Stoics differed from, let us say, the Cynics, who were, the original hippies, drop out, turn your back on things, it's pointless being engaged. The Stoics saw themselves as having a duty to participate, to take a responsible part in the life of the polis, in the life of the community. And I think those two strands, the activist and the, sort of hippie views are reflected there.
Staying with you for a moment, Anthony, do you think that the ideas expressed by Camus relate to Boethius? They do in very obvious ways, that they too immediately began to feed into people's thoughts about how they should live their life. They were taken up by politicians and other writers and so on.
Well, this demands a certain heroic leap from Boethius to Camus.
No, we went by way of Schopenhauer.
Yeah. I take it that the one thing that could be said in a sort of caricature sketch of Camus' views is that thinking that the world is intrinsically meaningless, that is, that there is no antecedent purpose for which we are born, for which we exist, places on us a demand to create meaning, to create value in the world, and to do it by choosing things that are especially productive of value. So things like creativity, things like love, things like respecting the dignity that's somehow inherent in this rather tragic situation that human beings find themselves in the absurdity of the world. And accepting the demands of one's radical freedom. I mean, if there is no antecedent purpose, then you are completely free to make choices, and it's up to you to reflect on those choices. Now, I'm glossing somewhat here because I think that if you were to take seriously the idea of the absurd and the idea of the meaninglessness of things, you might think that anything follows. But it was of importance to Camus, and I think to other existentialists of all stamps, that the challenge that was posed by absurdity was that we should try to seek and to impose value on life, which was genuinely defensible as value. And that's quite a hard thing to do in this, but it's an interesting challenge.
What just Gruden?
Yes, well, I agree with Anthony. This is a huge leap, but that particular moment in the history of Western consciousness, I see as something deviant. That people, this emphasis on this emphasis on the meaninglessness of everything, and the pure and absolute choice that this presents us with to be something other than nothing. The nothingness that those writers produced is, to me, the testimony to their lasting value. And I feel we've luckily we've grown up enough to put all that behind us.
Yes, sir.
Well, I think one way to fill in the leap between to Camus is to go back to Nietzsche and his response to Schopenhauer. And I think in important ways he perhaps prepares the way for Camus. But what's interesting in Nietzsche is that he at first was very attracted by Schopenhauer's idea and then rejected it and said that rather than trying to flee into this other world where we can find consolation, instead of consolation, we really need to, in a way, exert confrontation, and we need to face up to the terrible facts about reality. And actually, I've argued in my work that Nietzsche, in that way, I think ends up being more favorable to the Stoics than is often thought, precisely for the reason that the Stoics were willing to face up to reality, whereas people at the Epicureans sort of cut their cloth about what they thought the world was like just in order to console themselves. Now, of course, for Nietzsche, there's a limit to that, because he also says we can't live just by that honesty alone. We also need art to kind of make that bearable. Otherwise, we would have nausea and we would all give up. But nevertheless, there is a kind of intellectual honesty, and I think that marks the difference then, from some forms of existentialism that Roger mentioned.
Of course, but the art that coincided with Nietzsche was that of Wagner, in which renunciation is the principal theme for Wagner, and he was influenced, of course, by Schopenhauer. The way to achieve consolation is to renounce those things which cause in one the deep conflicts, and he showed how, in Tristan and Isolde at least, erotic love, which is the source of the major conflicts in human life, can actually be turned into a form of mutual renunciation in which it becomes higher than itself. And that's a remarkable thing to have done.
The great influence that Schopenhauer had both on Wagner and on Nietzsche, of course, was his view, tremendously interesting view, that music is the language of truth, ultimately, and that's a very speaking fact. But what we're seeing coming out of this discussion is that this difference that Roger first drew our attention to earlier, between the activist conception of consolation and the renunciatory conception of consolation. I get the sense that Roger is attracted more to the Wagnerian, Schopenhauerian view, perhaps, than the existentialist one, which is, essentially an activist one, because it says. By the way, I mean, if one had world enough and time, one would see that, of course, some of the more responsible existentialist thinking, which I think is to be found in Camus, the most interesting of them, accepts that there is a given situation. So we are thrown into history at a certain time, and there are constraints and there are facts that we have to deal with. So it's not as though we're in a vacuum entirely, but that it's in the realization that there are no antecedent or given values or purposes that this demand for an ethical activism is made. I find that interesting, I have to say, because it suggests that there is a sort of duty that we recognise in ourselves to think very carefully indeed about what matters and then to pursue it.
I would like to come back to you on Camus, Roger Scruton, if you don't mind. I do see a relationship, and you knocked me out of the studio, and that's perfectly right, between Boethius and Camus, in the sense that Camus said the most profound philosophical question is whether or not you put an end to your own life, and that the absurdity is that we look for meaning in a meaningless world. Out of that, you build a life on which you can base your actions. Now, that doesn't seem to me a very long way away from Boethius saying, or knowing, I am on my way to execution. How do I deal with this? I deal with this by working through a philosophy which will enable me to not only bear this, but to give this regard and perspective. I see a connection there, and not to necessarily to Camus' total disadvantage.
There is a connection, of course, in that both of them think that you can achieve what reconciliation is possible with the world in which we are by your own attitude. This isn't something given to you from outside. It has to come from within. But Boethius also thinks that he can rise to another perspective, which is God's perspective, and with God's help, of course, from which the world itself is seen to be other than it is, not meaningless at all, but meaningful. And Camus, of course, stays in that rooted down-to-earth perspective where only the meaninglessness is visible. And so, of course, he therefore has the question of suicide. And he lived in a reckless way which effectively was suicide. And, of course, we admire him in a way for that because, unlike Sartre, who is obviously a self-indulgent observer of things, Camus took his existentialism seriously and tried to find in it a philosophy of love.
There might be a sense in which some people listen to this programme saying consolation is all very well, but exhilaration is a lot better. And why don't we bring that into play? Melissa?
Well, that was those were the words I was going to use. I think that, in a way, the difference between Boethius and Camus is that difference between, as it were, consolation and exhilaration, that the difference, it's a difference in a way between accepting the world and sort of deciding as it is and being recalled to the world as you understand it to be, and then saying that you need to change the world. So Marx famously says the philosophers have only tried to understand the world. The need is now to change it. And that idea that what philosophy should do is to give you a model of a world that needs to become, that you need to bring about, as opposed to reconciling you to the world as it is a profound difference.
Well, of course, you can see that, somebody saying that exhilaration is indeed one form of consolation, but then that prompts the following thought, that exhilaration is ultimately wearying, and consolation of the sort of ataraxic kind, of the peaceful, tranquil kind, is ultimately boring. So it looks as though, if one wanted to get the best of both, what one would have to do is to effect some sort of rapprochement between them.
There is...
Hunting in the morning and literary criticism after dinner thing is what Marx's solution.
There has been an underlying sense in this discussion from the three of you and from me that philosophy can stand much in the place that Shelley said of poets, the unacknowledged legislators of the world. What is thought by these people enters into the way that people live their lives, conduct their lives, and set themselves goals. Would you think that that's true, Roger Scruton?
Well, it's certainly, of course, Plato's famous thesis in the Republic, that philosophers ought to be in charge of the political realm.
But isn't there a contradiction there? If philosophers are to look after their own lives, to withdraw to a longer perspective and a higher understanding and to retreat, how on earth can they get involved in politics anyway?
Oh, no, the writing is a way of being involved in politics. Boethius changed the whole nature of European society by what he wrote.
Mr. Lane.
One way in which philosophers become legislators, I think, is by becoming exemplars. And indeed, that's what Boethius became. It was through his example of being true in the end to his philosophic ideals, finding consolation in them, ceasing to rail against his fate and accepting it, that he became an example for how to live a good life. And I think that it's that embodiment of philosophy in a number of the philosophers of the past, as well as in their actual writings, that provides that consolation.
I think it's important to see that there is a broader sense of philosophy and a slightly narrower sense which bears on answering this question about how philosophy can help us to live better lives and make us better people. In the narrower sense, and certainly in the narrowest sense, which is contemporary academic philosophy, there may not be that many resources, in fact, for finding consolation or for living a good life, because it is a technical specialism which deals with problems, questions that are not always immediately relevant to the business of living.
Indeed, incredibly boring.
Some of it may be. But in the broader sense, a very great deal of very rich philosophical reflection is to be found in the reading of history and certainly in the reading of literature. Poetry. Very early on in this discussion, Roger pointed out that each of the books of Boethius begins with a poem. One thinks of that wonderful poem by Lucretius, De Rerum Natura. One thinks of the literary excellence of Plato's writing. That the philosophy itself, as we understand it in the tradition, and then this broader sense of philosophical wealth to be found in literature generally and in the study of history, the study of man, they provide resources for thinking about life, which makes philosophy in that broader sense perhaps the form of consolation, the form of a continual preparation for living a life that is good and for living it well.
Well, thank you very much, Melissa Lane, Anthony Grayling and Roger Scruton, and thanks for listening.
We hope you've enjoyed this Radio 4 podcast. You can find hundreds of other programmes about history, science and philosophy at bbc.co.uk/Radio 4.